Thank you very much for reminding us, of course, that international institutions must be part of the solution when addressing conventional as well as perhaps more non-traditional and human security questions, but also for, again, highlighting the normative influence of institutions. You highlighted the responsibility to protect doctrine, but also this notion of responsible sovereignty. And I was immediately intrigued by how this could be reconciled with Ambassador Nogami's idea of a Westphalian system. But let's now open the floor for questions and comments. Please introduce yourself and be brief. I have a gentleman right there. Yes.
Thank you very much. Ken Curtis is my name. One area where there, at the moment, seems to be a failure of governance, and we're sliding towards a situation that could become extremely problematic, is the Middle East. Within the last 3 or 4 weeks, Israel has effectively broken relationships with its 3 quote-unquote friends in the region, Turkey, Jordan, and Egypt. I use the word broken quite without much discipline, but we know what's happened. With the change in governments and that continuing process throughout the Middle East, we see a street that is slowly but surely becoming more focused on the issue of Palestine. We talked this morning about the importance of nuclear deterrence. I don't think Israel would be deterred by anything if it felt that something was going on that would lead to its existence being questioned. We have a covert and limited war going on between the United States and Iran through special forces, through a vast armada that's built up in the Gulf, through Iraq, or Iran being the winner of the Gulf War, or the Iraq War, at least regionally, with no major decision today being made in Iraq without virtually the okay of Tehran, and Iran using its surrogates throughout the region in this battle with America, and meantime, its own program, its own nuclear program. Things could slide very quickly in this region, so I would be really interested to hear the view of Ambassador Fahmy and perhaps others on the panel, frankly, how they see this situation.
Thank you.
The U.S. seems to be unable or unwilling to play the role it's been able to play in the past in this region. Politically, the U.S. president seems to be increasingly hampered from playing a role. Europe doesn't seem to have the weight to play the role. The UN, we're coming to a decision point over the next few days on the issue of the resolution of a Palestinian state. So this, in a global environment that's already extremely unstable, if something slips too fast and too far in the Middle East, we could be in a real pickle. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador Fahmy?
Sure. Thank you, and thank you for the question, although it'll take me an hour or so to respond to it seriously. But let me try to respond to the main points. First of all, the Middle East is going through a volatile period of change domestically. Nevertheless, I think that's a good direction. I think ultimately, when it stabilizes, as it does, if that is into a more democratic system, which I expect, as I said again, I'm confident it will. I'm just not sure how quickly, given circumstances. Once that happens, you will have a more transparent system that you can read and calculate the risks in it more regularly. At least that's what the democratic states have been telling us for years, that you need democracies because they're better than other options. So we're moving in that direction. Secondly, it does also mean, however, that governments will be more reactive to their people. In other words, they will be more short-term as they have to continue to be more strategic. Now, having said this and having the bruises all over me for having negotiated on the peace process for years, I remember whenever we raised the issue of the Arab street, The US would tell us, well, you're not serious about the Arab street. There's no real Arab street there. Well, it's there. And it will have to be recognized. The problems we have on the peace process. If there is an Arab democracy, that will serve the Arab world very well, but it will also serve Israel if it wants peace. If Israel doesn't want peace, in other words, by ending its occupation, Arab democracies will not serve Israel, because the Arab countries will not be able to look the other way as Israel continues to violate international law. But if one assumes that we're all moving to international norms, then one would assume also that Israel would want to move in that direction. Maybe it needs a little bit of tough love, but ultimately that's where we want to go. In terms of the US role, needless to say, in the Middle East at least, we're disappointed. When we're calling for resolving this through nonviolence, I don't think anybody can challenge that President Abu Mazen of Palestine and his Prime Minister, Salam Fayyad, are both promoting a nonviolent resolution to this conflict. When that is there and you can't find a serious negotiating partner, or the US, again, exercising its powers of persuasion with the Israelis to end occupation in exchange for normal relations with the Arab states, you, needless to say, have a problem. If, as was just mentioned earlier on, at the General Assembly in the next couple of days in the Security Council, the issue of Palestine is coming up repeatedly. The Palestinians never wanted to go to General Assembly or to the Security Council, frankly. We made a big mistake a long time ago, but anyway, they didn't want to go there. They went there because there's no serious negotiating process. And secondly, because in the absence of the process, things on the ground are eroding the possibility of peace. The Israelis are eating up territory, and they're trying to redefine, again, what are the parameters for the solution. And I take you back to the two guarantees that President George W. Bush offered the Israelis when I was in Washington, that they could take into account the changes on the ground in trying to resolve the settlement issue and so on. So the Palestinians are trying simply to confirm, and if you want, codify their rights and the parameters for resolving this conflict, so that when negotiations start in the future, they will be based on that, not on a new foundation. For an American president, and I'm going to respond to Ralph's request to be provocative, for an American president, less than, well, actually 12 months ago, to say he'd want to celebrate a Palestinian state at the UN this September, and now to say, well, I'm going to veto a resolution calling for exactly that, I think is just simply so flagrantly contradictory. You can't expect it not to affect U.S. credibility in the region quite significantly. But I think the Palestinians are going to do this in a two-step process, submitting the request to the Security Council, not pushing immediately for a vote in order not to immediately call for a Security Council veto by the U.S., seeing if they can negotiate a positive resolution, and then deciding whether to push it to the Security Council or to go to the General Assembly.
Thank you for your frank response. Yes, the gentleman with grey suit. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for giving me the floor. My question is directed to Dr. Shashi Tharoor. I know him for a long time. I heard him first in 1991 in my country. I'm a retired general of Bangladesh Army. At the moment, I'm teaching in the University of Malaya, Kuala Lumpur. My question is directed to you, and that is related to America-India strategic partnership. You are going for a historic partnership with Americans. And some of the authors are saying that India is trying to balance the Americans or bandwagon the Americans. Both of them are negative sort of connotations. And you are already a nuclear power which has been recognized by the Americans. You are part of the nuclear club. And you are asking for Security Council membership. And you talked about that concept of multi-alignment. Fine, that's good. But you are almost on the verge of doubling your defense budget. And you are buying 126 multi-role Eurofighters. It is on order, on card. It's going to be procured very soon. And Hillary Clinton has talked about India has neighborly problems with its neighbors, and it should take care of those. Try to become a benevolent leader of the SAARC region. You're talking about Security Council, you're talking about global governance, but you could not even make the SAARC viable or workable, mainly because of the strains between Pakistan and India, basically. If that could be resolved, then SAARC would have been more vibrant. And your President Kalam just said that you should be a leader of magnanimity. If all these things are taken into consideration, how do you think India can contribute to the how much India can contribute to the global governance?
Right. Well, that's a vast question. Thank you for it. Let me say first of all that with the U.S., partnership is a more appropriate term than alliance, in the sense that India is always going to be stubbornly non-aligned to any superpower, and it doesn't see its own relationships with third countries as in any way being at the behest of America or anyone else. So this notion of balancing China, for example, is simply not deemed in India to be an Indian interest, and we would not be doing it to serve anybody else's interests. So we feel that each relationship has its own logic. There is a very strong case for developing close relationships with the US, a country with which we have a lot in common in terms of political institutions and core values, and also an increasingly influential Indian minority in the US has been playing an influential role in that country in helping formulate policies. So it's a relationship we're happy to develop and strengthen, but we do not automatically agree with the US on every issue, as we will see, for example, on the Palestinian vote should it happen tomorrow. On the neighborhood, you're quite right that we do need to be magnanimous in our approach. The official doctrine in Delhi is one of asymmetrical relations with the neighbors. The argument is very much that we must accept that we need to give more than we get. India can't help the fact that when it sits around the table with the rest of the SAARC countries, that it accounts for about 70% of the population of South Asia and about 80% of the GDP. So whether or not it's trying to be obliging and friendly, it simply displaces more weight than anybody else, and that inevitably creates its own resentments and problems. And I think India has to be conscious of it and has to bend over backwards. That's very much my view. It's tough in a democracy. We just saw this with the recent visit of the Prime Minister to Bangladesh, where though a number of positive agreements were signed, including settling territorial issues that had been hanging around for 60 years, nonetheless, when it came to one particular act of magnanimity that New Delhi wanted on the Teesta River, it was not politically palatable for the coalition partner in the neighboring state of West Bengal, Paschim Banga, and the result indeed has been that that particular agreement couldn't be signed. There's always going to be these kinds of complications in a democracy. But I don't think India can be faulted specifically for the failure of SAARC to fulfill its potential, because as you quite rightly observed, the problem has lain in Pakistan's persistence in insisting that no normal relations are possible with India until Kashmir is solved to its satisfaction. And that has held up a number of things, a number of discussions in SAARC for many years now. Increasingly, there are SAARC countries suggesting that we should proceed with some ideas whether or not Pakistan wants to join. The notion of a South Asian free trade agreement, for example, that Bangladesh has been quite keenly pushing for some years, is one where conceivably the other members may decide to go along, leaving out those who don't wish to participate. But ideally, for the South Asian space to grow forward together, it does require a more open-minded and accommodating attitude by all countries. But I agree with you, India should be asymmetrically magnanimous.
Thank you. Just a quick reminder that the panelists also take brief and specific questions. We don't always have to go for the very broad ones. Yes, the gentleman front table.
My name is Pongsak Kuntakun from Sasin of Chulalongkorn University, Bangkok. I have one question for Dr. Dillon regarding to your open remark which have to do with food. Thailand is one or maybe the largest food exporter in the world in certain sector. Now, you're quite right that the food price have been depressed because of subsidy, and we all live in a connected world. Subsidy in US, in China, or even India actually depressed the price of commodity, especially rice price. That make the productivity in this sector terribly low over the last, I think, 4 decades. Now, the current government in Thailand, which have been hugely popular, elected in less than a month, have one policy to lift the price of rice above 15,000 baht per metric ton. That make the price of rice around the world rise from $500, I think, to $800 less than a month. Now, could you comment on this, how we're going to fix this? Because we are now being complained by the WTO not to do this. But at the same time, we have a poverty reduction problem for our farmer. How can we, keep them income rise? Now, the second question, if I have time, is for Dr. Shashi. I love your speech and I admire a lot. But at the same time, I want one concrete question to you. If you were Ministry of Foreign Affairs, what would be your top 3 priority between India and ASEAN bloc? Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Dillon first.
This is a very interesting question. You see, no country can develop unless there is structural transformation. And what we have seen, putting out all these developed countries that are now industrialist countries, they develop by protecting their agriculture, in fact, by even protecting their industry. The best thing is what you see in China. You don't liberalize your markets when the IMF pressures you to do so. You liberalize your markets when you are ready to compete. So, unless you give the farmers fair prices, you put up a set of incentives that enables them to continue to enhance their productivity and efficiency, then they are not going to be able to climb out of drudgery. And unless you do that, you see there are only 2 ways out of poverty: education and capital formation at the household level. When we had long time ago PL4AT and all these things, then the World Bank comes around and said, "Oh, Dillon, we don't want to invest in irrigation in your country anymore. Prices are so low, the return on investment." So, you kill the farmers. They can't do anything. And now when you have high prices, who benefits? Cargill, of course. So, unless there is proper sequencing, you can never develop a country. So in your case, you have done better than many of... We did something very well between 733 and 83. We went on a quest for self-sufficiency in rice, and lo and behold, what happened? The world had never witnessed such a rapid decline in rural poverty. Vietnam did that about 6-7 years ago. Brazil did that 2 years ago. So the point is, you have to give them adequate incentives to enhance their productivity and efficiency to climb out of that. Thanks.
3 top priorities. Well, I mean, off the top of my head, first, conclude pending agreements. We have recently concluded a free trade agreement on goods. We need to complement that with a free trade India-ASEAN agreement on services. There's been pending discussions, not yet agreement stage, on improved tourism access between countries. I think there are more Indian tourists coming to Southeast Asia than there are coming from Southeast Asia to India. We need to remedy that. Second, I think we need to develop improved road, rail, and water connectivity from our northeast to the countries of Southeast Asia through Myanmar and Thailand down to the peninsula. We can do that. It would actually enhance the development of our own northeast. It's been held back for various reasons, but that should be a priority, it seems to me. A land route also down the river and by road and rail through Myanmar. Third, increased geopolitical consultations with the countries of ASEAN on various sorts of issues. We are already present, as you know, at the East Asian Summit, though we accept that we're by no stretch of the geopolitical imagination an East Asian country. But talking to you all much more about what your priorities are and concerns are, so that we in turn can play a modest but constructive role in your sense of geopolitical security would be another priority as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Rana. Yes.
Right. I am an economist, so I am not versatile enough to discuss all aspects of governance. But looking at the assessment of G20 that Ambassador Nogami gave us, he told us, of course, he was pessimistic, but I thought he was overly pessimistic. Let me argue why. He said that Washington and Toronto summits were success. They were a success because there was a shared objective, that to fight the crisis. Everybody got together, coordination, massive stimulus packages from all over the world. So the Great Depression was averted. We had the Great Depression instead. Now, of course, the world is on a recovery mode, unless Europe implodes. We talked about that. Let's assume that the world is in a recovery mode. There are no shared objectives, so the G20 is not successful. I think that we're not using the right parameter to judge. The success of an institution should be measured precisely when there is no shared objective, I think, maybe if I'm not wrong. At least the G20 has been able to bring all these people, high-level policy leaders together and discuss issues which were not discussed before. For example, issues of global imbalance that we talked about with Lord Mandelson this morning. That was a big issue. It has been discussed for many, many years. IMF tried its best under its bilateral surveillance program, did not succeed. IMF was given a new mandate of multilateral surveillance, where it brought together systemically important countries to do that. It was not successful. A G20 has at least made some progress. A set of indicators have been agreed upon to monitor. Of course, that has to be implemented. And G20 has also started to oversee the regulatory framework works of the Basel BS Financial Stability Board and its implementation. So I am more optimistic than he is on the assessment of that. My second point, Ralph, I'll take just a minute. This is Ambassador Fahmy's point and Shashi Tharoor's point. Bretton Woods institutions were set up in 1945 when US was the hegemon, and now it is out of date. A balance of power has shifted. We're moving to a multipolar world, or Urban Mathur G1 world, G1 not led by US, but by China. So we need a different architecture. Governance of these institutions is impossible to reform. So it looks to me that we need a more decentralized architecture. Fahmy's point, we should help these institutions to be more representative. Let's have the Bretton Woods institutions supported by regional institutions in Asia, Latin America, and Africa. It seems to me that that may be the right way to go in the future.
Okay, Ambassador, would you like to respond first?
I said the G20 process produced the tangible results in the first three meetings. The results you mentioned, the tangible output you mentioned, are all the products of those first three meetings. What I was really concerned is the failure of following up of macroeconomic policy coordination in Seoul process. The unholy, if I may say, unholy alliance between China and Germany on the current account surplus, and all these issues. So macroeconomic policy coordination is no longer a sort of major issue, a task of G20. G20 in coming this next session in France will talk about all sorts of regulation on the market, and I'm a bit worried about this process because, as Peter Mandelson said, the pendulum is swinging toward more toward the restriction. You are sending, you are shooting the messenger. You are regulating the market. Fine, but in fact, the market is sending you only a message, and what they are trying to do at the moment, this regulating commodity market, futures market, and all these markets, and I think we are moving into a sort of dangerous direction. shooting the messengers. So I'm a bit pessimistic about the future direction of G20. Yes, they have produced tangible results, but at the moment, they do not have a sort of shared objectives. That's the concern I expressed.
Okay, second question, decentralization, regional governance over global governance. Ambassador Fahmy? And
I think we'll always be under two conflicting pressures here. By becoming smaller, are we more efficient? Or are becoming larger, are we more representative? People are complaining about the UN being complicated and slow. It is, but it's because it has a lot of stakeholders. We have to find a balance where we are efficient but representative. And let me just give you an example, because the mention of Bretton Woods came up. When I went back from Washington in 2008, I attended a seminar, a public lecture by our Minister of Finance, who was a very smart man. And he was asked immediately, well, what do you think of this financial crisis, and what is the solution to it? And the minister, who headed an IMF ministerial group, said, you know, I met all the ministers, and they're really smart people, so I'm sure they're going to come up with a good answer. I couldn't help myself. I put up my hand, and even though I was still in government, I put up my hand and I stood up, and he, of course, recognized me, and he said, Ambassador, what do you think? He said, well, aren't these the same people who got us to this problem? He started to laugh, and I was laughing, but my point really was, and I am sure they're smart people, I have no question about that, but they represent certain trends, and they're affected by certain politics and certain markets. When we are more representative, it doesn't mean we're going to have all the answers, or that we won't make any mistakes. But I think the mistakes will be smaller, even if we're slower, and the answers will be more reflective of the trends that are there internationally and the interests. So I'm, again, for a more representative, both in terms of membership as well as in terms of the mechanisms of international institutions, be that either by changing them or, as I mentioned earlier, by having more interregional contacts and consequently also contacts between regional organizations and international ones. Thank you.
Well, actually, I agree with that. I mean, essentially, there's always going to be a need to balance between the advantages of universality and the feasibility of decentralization. Amongst the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank is already very effectively complemented now by the Inter-American Development Bank and the Asian Development Bank and the African Development Bank and so on. And one could argue that the IMF's role in stabilizing the macroeconomic picture is already now being supplanted by the work of the G20. I've heard Mr. Nogami, but at least you have an evenly balanced institution of both North and South, 20 governments representing economies of varying sizes, but all pretty important ones to take into account. I think institutions are evolving. I'm not sure we can, in any case, prescriptively decentralize the kind of macroeconomic work of either the IMF or the G20. But we can bring in different inputs from different parts of the grassroots. And if you can do that, you might end up with an overall result that's more satisfactory.
Okay, I will start collecting a few questions now, starting on my left, and please be brief. Ron Hoskin from the ANU.
Thank you, Ralph. Ron Hoskin, the Australian National University. I have a question that began to take shape in the panel before lunch, and it's sort of kind of crystallized in this panel. We're talking then against the high probability of a sustained and relatively rapid transition in power, if you like. Let's assume that that transition runs its course and that we muddle through without hegemonic war and all that sort of stuff. At the end of which the symbolism falls into place. That is, we have someone heading the IMF by the name of Yao, for example, somebody heading the World Bank by the name of Mababani, that resistance to Security Council reform breaks down, and at a minimum Japan and India become permanent members. Let's say all that's in place. The question that I wondered about was, what, if anything, would feel decisively different about world governance at that point, where the prime movers, say, were Beijing and Delhi, rather than Washington, London, Paris, if you like, the familiar. Can the panel speculate in any way about, the likely, is there likely to feel a difference in what global governments would look like and feel like at that time?
Thank you, Ron. Let's hold your thoughts. Let's take an additional question here. The gentleman, middle row.
Thank you. I'm Kamal Malhotra from the United Nations. My question is to Ambassador Fahmy. If the Palestinian vote goes ahead this week at the United Nations in New York, and the threats that have been indicated by various parties also go ahead in terms of the financial side and other threats, what is likely to be the scenario, and what is the response of the League of Arab States as the premier regional governance body sort of likely to be? And of course Egypt as the major neighbor and also the major member of the League of Arab States. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other question at this point? Then we'll address those two first. Who would like to start? Yes.
I'll address actually both, but very quickly. If we simply change the players rather than the system, then all we've achieved is applying the same system, but one more reflective of today's reality. In other words, it's not World War II reality anymore, but it's the same system established by World War II, where it's the balance of power between the more powerful. I think that is a step forward, but not a large enough step forward. We need to change the system and change and make it more representative. On the second point, well, again, Palestinians are going to the UN only because there is no serious negotiating process with any real potential for success based on the two-state solution, Palestine, Israel, and peace between Arabs and Israelis. That's the only reason why they go. Now, if they go and there is a vote in the Security Council and consequently the threats are implemented, in other words, sanctions against the Palestinians bilaterally with the US without cutting off economic assistance, what you will be doing here, at least 3 or 4 different things. One, the US will lose credibility in the Arab world, that it is now taking actions against the occupied rather than against the occupier. But more so, you will actually either make President Abu Mazen and Prime Minister Salam Fayyad heroed martyrs. In other words, they will be looked at as being heroes, but they will be sacrificed because we'll be killing the peace process. Or you're going to promote the death of the peace process, in other words, pursuing the solution through negotiations rather than through violence. So this is a really very serious consequence. It may not happen the day after, but this is what you're doing here is discrediting the peace process as a whole, rather than simply these 2 individuals, but them included. Now, what will the Arab world do and what will Egypt do? Egypt's busy, but we will get into the act again, but we're really busy with some stuff. Now the Arab League as a institution, I leave aside, but its members, frankly, they have to step up and provide the assistance in place of what the Palestinians will need, at least the basic assistance. Not because they're responsible to do that, but because they have a moral authority to help and to relieve the pressure on the Palestinians. But you're looking for a serious discredit in the peace process, and that's what is, I think, most worrisome. Again, Egypt will have to find a way between resolving its domestic transformation and its regional issues, because they will become domestic issues more and more. We have 2 elections coming up, for parliament and for president. Believe me, if the Palestinian issue was prominent in the past, hold 2 free and fair elections in less than 6 months, and it becomes an agenda issue on the elections. So that will also become something where we will move on very quickly. Hopefully, in the next couple of weeks, rational minds will prevail. We'll find some ways to move this forward, but I am truly worried about the prospects for peace in the Middle East.
Dr. Dillon? Yeah. I think our friend from Canberra is asking posing a much more fundamental question. I think the paradigm of governance has to change. Yeah? What do we want governance for? What are our objectives? And this, as I said, from the early days, they say go forth and multiply. We have to change that. And I've told my Muslim friends in Indonesia about that, that you are not a Khalifa, that you are not a master. You are a steward of all this. So the paradigm has to change. We have to become, as President Kalam was saying, strike a better balance between us and nature. All right? We have to be more spiritual. So you cannot have just a change of players unless you change the paradigm and you change the value system that we call a civilization.
Structural transformation. Then some final thoughts from both of you?
After him, I'll give.
Well, as I said in my presentation, we are not really sure whether those emerging powers are really status quo powers or revisionist powers. So my answer is we don't know, because they have not shown their cards yet. So we don't know what would make the difference.
Well, I'd agree that replacing an IMF Western chief in a skirt with a Chinese chief in a skirt may not actually necessarily change anything, but that I think is not the point. The point is that indeed you would bring people with a different set of values and political and economic experiences and priorities to the table, operating an existing system perhaps, but part of the deal has to be that having long served as subjects of an international system whose rules are written by others, that these new countries get to play a role in writing the rules themselves. And that unless there is resistance from the Western countries or the Northern countries, whatever you want to call them, who currently rule the roost, to permitting these new emerging countries their own fair shake of determining the rules of global governance and the norms of global governance, unless there is resistance, I think you will see a change. In what areas that changes and how deep it'll go and how fast it'll happen, I suspect Mr. Nogami is right. We don't know yet. Because everyone who's in a decision-making position in these emerging countries has themselves grown up in the existing system. But once you get to be a subject and a rule maker, rather than an object and a rule taker, you will start doing things differently.
Thank you. The panelists have generally adopted a glass half empty approach. It looks like a lot more needs to be done before a new form of global governance emerges, and I suspect that we will have many more panels at future SGDs on this topic. So in the meantime, please join me in thanking the four panelists for what has been a very stimulating discussion.